All right, so today we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff. Muammar Gaddafi, I mean, this is a name everyone's heard, right?
Definitely. A figure who, well, let's just say he left his mark on history.
That's putting it mildly. We've got all these excerpts, like from his early days all the way to, the really controversial policies and everything in
His
between.
life is, well, you could almost say it reads like a movie script.
hmm
Coups, revolutions, oil wealth, international intrigue. It's all there.
Oh, absolutely. But, we're not just going to rehash the basic Gaddafi biography here. I think anyone tuning in probably has a decent grasp of the broad strokes,
All
right?
right.
This deep dive, it's about going deeper. It's about unpacking the complexities of Gaddafi's legacy. Because it's not simple, is it?
Not at all. He's one of those figures who defies easy categorization. I mean, you
Yeah.
have this revolutionary leader who overthrows a monarchy and then rules for over 40 years.
And on the one hand, he implemented these incredible social programs like free healthcare, education, even housing. I mean, things that a lot of countries could only dream of.
Absolutely. And he used Libya's oil wealth um, to really try to create a more equitable society, at least in theory.
But then at the same time, he was a dictator, right? He ruthlessly silenced any opposition, crushed dissent, and was implicated in all sorts of human rights abuses.
Right. And that's where it gets really difficult, trying to reconcile those two sides of Gaddafi, the champion of social justice and the brutal authoritarian.
Exactly. It's that tension that I think makes him so fascinating, so worthy of a deep dive.
And his Green Book is a great place to start if you really want to get inside his head.
The Green Book, yeah. It's a pretty wild read, isn't it? You've got this mix of like Islamic socialism and direct democracy. And it's not just theory, right?
No, not at all. He really tried to put these ideas into practice in Libya. And it's that attempt, that experiment, that I think reveals so much about his worldview, his ambitions, and ultimately his failures.
It's definitely ambitious. You can feel it like radiating off the pages. But before we get too deep into the Green Book, I kind of want to rewind, go back to the beginning. I mean, imagine being 27 years old and staging a coup.
Yeah, it's not your average career path, that's for sure. But it speaks to the audacity of Gaddafi, doesn't it? And the political climate of the time. I mean, this is the late 1960s. The Arab world is in upheaval. You
Yeah.
have these young, charismatic leaders emerging, challenging the old order, and Gaddafi's right there in the thick of it.
Seizing the moment, toppling a monarchy, establishing a republic, it's pretty remarkable. And then he manages to stay in power for over 4 decades.
Which, let's be honest, is almost unheard of in that region, especially given the often turbulent nature of politics there.
And he had that oil wealth, right? I mean, it's hard to overstate how much that shaped Libya's trajectory and Gaddafi's rule.
It's this double-edged sword, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have the potential to transform a nation, to lift people out of poverty, to provide them with opportunities they wouldn't have otherwise. And Gaddafi, to his credit, did some of that.
He did. But then there's that other edge of the sword. The way that oil wealth can be used to entrench power, to silence dissent, to create a system where loyalty is bought and dissent is crushed.
And that's where I think the real moral dilemmas arise. Because on paper, some of Gaddafi's social programs were admirable, even groundbreaking for the time.
Right, and I'm sure for many Libyans, life did improve under his rule, but it came at a steep price, the price of freedom, the price of basic human rights. And that's the paradox we're going to keep unpacking as we dive deeper into this source material.
Absolutely, because understanding Gaddafi means understanding the seductive nature of power, the way that good intentions can become twisted, and the enduring tension between progress and freedom. And all that plays out on an even grander scale when we look at Gaddafi's actions on the world stage.
Oh, yeah, because he wasn't content with just reshaping Libya, was he? He wanted to, he wanted to be a major player in global politics.
He saw himself as a revolutionary leader, a champion of the oppressed. And that led him to support all sorts of movements and groups, some of them quite controversial, to say the least.
Like the IRA in Northern Ireland or the ANC in South Africa, he was drawn to these anti-imperialist struggles, seeing them as part of a larger fight against Western hegemony.
He definitely had a knack for tapping into anti-Western sentiment, and he wasn't afraid to use that to his advantage.
But that same ideology, that same anti-Western zeal, it also led him down some pretty dark paths, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can't talk about Gaddafi without talking about Lockerbie.
Lockerbie bombing, yeah. It was a horrific act of terrorism that killed hundreds of innocent people and turned Gaddafi into a global pariah.
And it really cemented his image as a sponsor of terrorism, a rogue actor on the world stage.
But then, here's the thing. In the 2000s, he does this complete 180. He renounces terrorism, disarms, gives up Libya's WMD programs, and starts cozying up to the West.
It was a pretty dramatic shift, and it left a lot of people scratching their heads. Was it a genuine change of heart or a calculated move to ensure the survival of his regime?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it speaks to the slipperiness of Gaddafi as a historical figure. Was he a true believer, a master manipulator, or some complex combination of both? I don't know if we'll ever have a definitive answer.
Probably not. But that's what makes exploring his life and legacy so fascinating, because it forces us to grapple with these ambiguities, these contradictions, and ultimately to confront the uncomfortable truths about power, ideology, and the human capacity for both good and evil.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So we've got this young, ambitious leader who stages a coup, reshapes Libyan society with oil wealth, rules with an iron fist, becomes a global pariah, and then seems to try to redeem himself on the world stage.
And all of that, that's just the prelude to the final act of his life.
Right, because the Arab Spring is about to erupt, and Gaddafi, well, he won't be immune to its impact. You know, it's funny, because when we talk about the Arab Spring, we tend to kind of lump it all together like it was this one big thing.
Right.
But it was really more like a wave of uprisings all across the region.
Yeah, it's important to remember that.
And each one had its own kind of unique flavor, its own, specific set of grievances and dynamics.
Absolutely. And the way those movements played out varied a lot depending on where you were.
Exactly. So like in Tunisia and Egypt, you had these relatively peaceful transitions of power.
Relatively peaceful, yeah.
But in other places like Libya and Syria, it was way more violent, way more messy.
Yeah, and the role of outside powers like, the U.S. and Europe, it also varied quite a bit.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
So it's not really accurate to talk about the Arab Spring as like this single monolithic event.
Right. It was more like a catalyst, something that kind of set off all these different chain reactions.
And in Libya, where Gaddafi had been in power for like over 40 years, those calls for change, they were met with brutal repression.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
I mean, you weren't about to give up power that easily.
Which is kind of ironic, isn't it? This guy who built his whole persona around being a revolutionary,
Yeah.
he ends up being the one clinging to power, trying to crush any hint of dissent.
You could say that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I mean, what do you think was going through his mind at that point? Did he really believe he could just squash this uprising?
Hard to say, but you got to remember he'd ruled unchallenged for so long, he probably couldn't imagine a world where he wasn't in control.
Yeah, like he'd become so isolated, so detached from reality.
Maybe he thought he could just, use the same tactics that had worked in the past, crack down hard on the protesters and they'd back down.
But this time it was different. The people weren't afraid anymore.
And they had social media, which helped them organize and get their message out to the world.
Right, so the whole world was watching as this uprising unfolded.
And Gaddafi's brutality, it was on full display for everyone to see.
Which is probably why the international community eventually got involved.
Yeah, there was a lot of pressure to do something to protect civilians.
So NATO intervened with airstrikes and no-fly zones.
Which was a controversial decision, of course.
Totally. Some people argued it was necessary to prevent a massacre. Others said it was overreach, meddling in another country's affairs.
And it's hard to say for sure what would have happened if NATO hadn't intervened.
Right, maybe the rebels would have eventually overthrown Gaddafi on their own. Maybe it would have been even more bloody.
Who knows? But one thing's for sure, the intervention changed the course of the conflict.
It definitely hastened the end of Gaddafi's reign.
But it also left Libya in a very precarious position.
Oh yeah, the country was in shambles, the government was in disarray, and there were all these armed groups vying for power.
And then, of course, you had the whole dramatic scene of Gaddafi's capture and death.
Oh man, those images were wild. Him being dragged out of that drainage pipe, beaten and killed.
It was a brutal end to a brutal reign.
But even though he was gone, the violence didn't stop.
Right, it just kind of morphed into a new kind of chaos.
All these different militias, tribal groups, political factions, all fighting for control.
And the country basically descended into civil war.
Yeah, it's like they traded one dictator for 100 warlords.
Pretty much. And that's where we'll pick up in part 3.
The long and winding road of post-Gaddafi Libya.
It's a story of hope and despair, of progress and setbacks, of a nation struggling to find its way after decades of authoritarian rule.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like you get rid of the dictator, you think, okay, things are going to get better now.
Right.
But it's rarely that simple, is it?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't just erase decades of authoritarian rule and expect everything to magically fall into place.
It's like you're trying to build a new house on like a foundation that's all cracked and crumbling.
Exactly. You got to rebuild those institutions. You got to restore trust in the government. You got to give people a reason to believe in the future.
And in Libya, it's like all that pent-up frustration and anger and resentment, it all just exploded when Gaddafi was gone.
Yeah, all those divisions that had been suppressed for so long, they all came rushing to the safest.
Tribal conflicts, political rivalries, a whole bunch of armed groups with different agendas.
And then you had outside powers getting involved, trying to influence things for their own benefit.
It became a total mess, right?
Pretty much. And the Libyan people, they got caught in the crossfire.
They just wanted a better life, you know, a chance to live in a free and democratic society.
And instead, they got more violence, more instability, more suffering.
It's heartbreaking, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it makes you wonder, like, is there any way to break this cycle?
Like, is there a path forward for Libya, or is it just doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over?
Well, I wouldn't say doomed, but it's definitely a long and difficult road ahead.
Okay, so what needs to happen? What are the first steps?
Well, for one thing, they need a stable government.
Hmm.
A government that can actually provide basic services and security.
Easier said than done, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you've got all these different factions vying for power. It's hard to see them coming together anytime soon.
And then there's the issue of disarmament, right?
All those militias running around with their guns, they got to be brought under control.
But how do you do that without just creating more violence?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And there's no easy answer.
It's like a giant puzzle with a million pieces and no instruction manual.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But even in the midst of all this chaos, there are some glimmers of hope.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, for one thing, there have been some attempts at dialogue and reconciliation.
Really?
Yeah. Not always successful, but at least it shows that some people are willing to talk.
And that's got to be a good sign, right?
It is. And there are also a lot of ordinary Libyans, everyday people who are working to rebuild their communities.
Yeah. Like doctors and teachers and business owners just trying to get on with their lives.
Exactly. They haven't given up hope, and they deserve our support.
They do. So even though things look pretty bleak right now, you're saying there's still a chance for Libya to turn things around.
There's always a chance. And the Libyan people, they've shown incredible resilience in the face of adversity.
Well, that's good to hear. So
Yeah.
what's the takeaway here? Like, what can we learn from Gaddafi's rise and fall and the chaos that followed?
I think one of the big lessons is that power corrupts, and that even revolutions can go wrong.
Yeah, and that building a democracy is really hard work, especially after decades of dictatorship.
It takes time. It takes patience. It takes a commitment from everyone involved.
And maybe a little bit of luck, too.
Maybe. But even if Libya never becomes like this perfect model of democracy, there's still hope that they can build a better future for themselves.
I think that's a good note to end on, don't you think?
I do. It's a story of tragedy and hope of destruction and renewal of a nation struggling to find its way.
And we'll be watching closely to see what happens next.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex legacy of Muammar Gaddafi. It's been a wild ride.
It has.